Welcome everyone. My name is Harmony. My ancestral name is Laucus and I'm from the Tla'amin Nation here in British Columbia. And I'm joining today from Tsleil-Waututh territory. Welcome to our second webinar in our series. And to get us started in a good way, I'm going to hand it over to Frank Dragon, Senior Treaty Implementation Advisor. Over to you, Frank.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I hope you guys had a great day yesterday. So let's pray. Creator, on this day and always, watch over us and our loved ones. Grant us the patience to listen to what we've been taught, to be thankful for the gifts that we've been given, to be grateful for those putting their faith in us. We accept the love placed upon us. We shall be respectful to one another. We shall share your teachings with our youth and our children, and always be thankful for today and tomorrow. Chew. Cool.
Thank you. So welcome to everyone. I'm not sure how many folks we have here today that were here also yesterday. So I'll just do a very brief little recap of the webinar series, which is organized by a group of the self-governing Indigenous governments that are involved in a collaborative fiscal process that we heard a little bit about yesterday. So as part of that process, this webinar series and associated advisor support and toolkit is being provided to provide some very practical tools and knowledge for the Indigenous governments to carry out their responsibilities, and focusing on how do we use data to support our roles and responsibilities as Indigenous governments. Data can seem alienating for people. It can seem like it's an area for specialists, but really we all use data every day. And the more we can use data, the better decisions we can make, the better investments we make in our programs and services, the better we can report on progress and celebrate the successes that we have. So that's really the practical nature of what it is we're talking about here, is embedding data within the cycle of planning, management, and accountability. That's really tied to the vision, values, and goals of the self-determining Indigenous governments. So today is the second webinar in the series. We're going to take the first hour and talk about a self-assessment tool, which is really the centerpiece tool of the toolkit. So we'll do a very good walkthrough of that instrument. We'll take a short break, and then hour two today we'll focus on change management. So how do we support our citizens, our leadership, our colleagues through the change as we look to better embed and hardwire the use of data and evidence in our responsibilities. Next slide, please. Just a recap on housekeeping. We are recording this webinar and we will be posting that either in full or in part on the Toolkit website. You will not be able to unmute or turn your video on yourself, but we are going to try today to include more interactive discussion aspects of the webinar. We know yesterday was very much of a one-way information, and today we're hoping to stimulate some dialogue. So to ask questions, we'll ask that you, if it's throughout or in the middle of a presentation, at any time, throw any comments or questions into the chat. And we're going to also try, time permitting, to create time for discussion, during which time, if you would like to ask your question verbally, you can use the hands up function and we'll go to you. So just a few personal notes or housekeeping notes. You just heard that dinging in the background. I don't know how to turn that off. That's like my text thing. Now it's going to start going like crazy. So I've got to figure that out on my end. We're doing our best with the technology. I'm just doing my best. I'm going to try not to talk too fast. I get excited and I get going. So I'm trying to pace myself. My second monitor is over here. So if I look like I'm just like gazing off into the distance stoically, I'm not. I'm paying attention to my other screen. And I'm really working on my own terminology. I do a lot of work here in BC and I use the word nation a lot. And I know in this context that it's more appropriate to use the word Indigenous government. So I'm working on that. And if I slip up, it's unintentional, but you can let me know that I've slipped up so I can continue to improve. Next slide, please. We all know how to use Zoom at this point, I hope. But bottom left-hand corner, mute, unmute, and start, stop video. Again, you won't be able to do that unless the master of the Zoom gives you permission. There's the chat function in the bottom bar as well, which we're hoping to get some interactivity. So I don't see anything in the chat yet. If folks want to say hello or good morning or something, let me know that you're out there. Right now, I'm just looking at the screen of my own face. I would appreciate it. And then there's the raise hand function on the bottom right-hand corner when we get to the discussion part. Next slide, please. So what did we talk about yesterday? I just wanted to take just a minute to reflect on webinar 1. So a couple of things we did yesterday. One is we did a tour of the toolkit. So you can see there's a link on the screen. And today we're again going to really, as much as we can, make that connection between the content that you're seeing and where you can go for further tools and applied practical information from the toolkit. We talked about our case study, and we're going to see that picked up by webinar presenters throughout the series, including today on change management. And I'm really thankful that people are throwing their good mornings and good afternoons and everything else into the chat. It makes me feel like I'm not alone here. Yesterday, we heard from Gwen Phillips from Tunaqa Nation, and you know, they have a very specific experience at Tunaqa, but that was kind of why we wanted Gwen to come and speak to us yesterday. You know, they have a very strong approach around their philosophy, their worldview, their definitions. And from that, they're kind of building out their data and performance measurement and accountability systems. And that's true of all of our self-governing Indigenous governments that are on this call and that I'm part of in my home community. So the point was to kind of let's spotlight an example of a nation that's really trying to draw through their vision all the way through to their data systems and how they're approaching that. And it's not going to be the same for everyone, but I do think that we learned a lot about how Tunaqa are approaching it. And I find it inspiring to hear Gwen and hear about their approach. So, you know, she really talked about sovereignty and self-determination as the foundation for everything they do, and they've built out from there. They very much have kind of built their vision, their values, and their goals in a way that really reflects who they are as Tunaqa people, their worldview, and what matters to their citizens. And they're now in a process where they're tying indicators and measurement to those goals and visions directly. So something that she talked about, for example, yesterday was use of the term or the indicator, moving away from output indicators, how many people came to the workshop, towards indicators about, she talked about the number of Tunaqa students that are achieving their education plans. So like that's what matters to them, is just that their people are able to achieve their own personal goals. And so that's the indicator that they measure. And so we know that part of our work is to find the data about us that is collected in the system and to use that for our own advocacy. And this is where kind of the gap measurement comes in. And those things are important because that tells us how well those other systems are serving our people. And we also have an opportunity to develop indicators and measurement that matter to us and our worldviews and our way of living in the world. She also talked about the philosophy of data as a grandmother perspective. We as Indigenous people have a history of data being used against us, of stories being told about us, about our deficits. And that's really not what this exercise is about, right? This is not about Big Brother managing us. This is about us measuring and collecting data because we care and we want to make things better. So those were a few things that I took away from yesterday's webinar. And again, like loving to see in the chat, everyone sharing their reflections on Gwen's presentation. I appreciate that. Next slide, please. So what I'm trying to do at the start of each webinar is talk about a couple of key concepts, a couple of terms that we're going to hear a lot throughout the day. So yesterday's terms are there. I'm not going to go through them again, but they related to a lot of the core pieces about data, data sovereignty, data governance, particular, and OCAP we talked a little bit about, an indicator and outcome. The data governance and management piece will be a big part of the webinars that are yet to come. Today, a couple of things we're talking about. So assessment we're talking about. So how do we understand current state of something, right? How do we know we're ready, willing, and able to do what it is we want to do? And that's really what an assessment tool is about. And so we're going to spend the first hour on a tool that's helping us understand where our governments are at relative to our interest in data. We're also going to talk about change management today. So change management is really how do we support people through the change. So whatever change is happening, we know that we have a whole range of people that have different appetite for change. So some people like to change things because they find change fun, right? They're always moving their furniture around or whatever in their house. Then we have people that they want to understand why a change is going to happen. And once they understand that, then they're ready to roll with it. And then we've got people who really resist change. You know, I've got a cousin that if you ask him to change something or you tell him that a change is occurring, his first question is, whose idea was this? Because he has a lot of questions. He needs to know, whose idea is it? How much is this going to cost? Why are we doing this? What's going to benefit me from this change? And so we have people all along the spectrum. And there's a certain approach to involving and supporting people through change as we look to embed data more fulsomely in the work that we do as Indigenous governments. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So those are the kind of key terms to keep in mind as we get going. Next slide, please. So we're going to jump into our first module today. So again, this is about, are we ready, willing, and able to undertake this kind of work? Where are our governments in that journey? And then how do we get from here to there using the toolkit that's been provided as part of this work? So I'm handing it over here to Adam Perry, who's going to take us through this component.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Harmony can. Great. Thanks for that introduction, Harmony. It's a little difficult to not present to an audience because I like to see feedback. So I know Harmony is doing a great job. So my name is Adam Perry. I work for the Nisga'a Nation. I'm an employee of the Nisga'a Nation for the last 5 years. And my role there is to work a lot with data and to sort of support the different departments through the journeys as they take it to collecting appropriate data, making funding decisions, perhaps thinking about performance measurement and what that means, and just trying to put in front of the executive and elected leaders the right kind of information for them to discuss and make decisions. I'd say we're a data-informed government, so data often moves up the chain of command, going through certain channels of executive, senior management to executive, and then ultimately the executive and others implement the projects, and the various departments implement on the projects. So we'll get into how that reflects to assessment today. A couple things just before we get, I have a few slides just to contextualize where assessments are placed in terms of strategy and management. And I think that might help and build off the previous speaker and going forward. So I also sit as a member of the Data Steering Committee, part of the collaborative fiscal policy process, and happy that we were able to bring resources together to support people and support teams, consultants and other officials from different governments, the technical folks, to really build this platform out. And the goal here really is to build a supportive network for your nations and for your Indigenous governments. Harmony, I'm like you, I use nations as well as self-governing Indigenous governments, and I think most people do use nations. At the end of the day, this is really about self-determination and putting in place governments where they need to manage the land and take care of the people as they see fit. I was really happy to see the turnout. We were perhaps expecting 4 or 5 people and just to be speaking to ourselves. So I'm glad yesterday to hear that 80 or so people were there. And again, we really want to learn together and build out our networks and support. We know Indigenous governments and nations contribute to rural economies. They're drivers of social and economic benefit to Indigenous and non-Indigenous people alike. I just see a comment from that we don't use nations, and it's the Nazi government. So there is a lot of difference too in how this works. So that's helpful, Belinda. Thanks. And I heard, I've heard Gwen speak. She's very inspirational, and I'm really glad she was able to come out and be our first speaker. I think that's really important for how we brainstorm and how we think about the context we work in, just as Belinda raises, and I work for the Nisga'a Nation, right, as a modern treaty and self-government. There's nuances and differences in the context and the cultures we work. So it's really important to learn and take from these webinars what you can in terms of morphing it and adapting it to the specific needs of your people and citizens. Okay, I think I'll start. I'm just on the title, so I might go over. So Harmony, keep me on track. But the title really captures a lot of the work. If I just go back to the title just for a sec. So I titled it Planning Assessments and Data and Decisions. We're really after decisions, but it can be quite a stressful journey to know what data to collect, how to collect it. We're overworked. We're sometimes managing many files on the side of our desk. So really, I titled this, I'm stressed already when we talk about this. And I think for a lot of people at the government level and the departmental level, wearing many hats, we can get stressed out when we think of change management and planning and strategy. So you're not alone in that quest. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I'll run through this quickly. Obviously, with governance and Indigenous governments, there's a context of accountability we all have to work in. We have funding relationships, so we have to think about the accountability on a few levels, what that means to our citizens, but what that means to the funders and that sort of thing. Across that, data becomes important. There's also, as Harmony mentioned, how do you think of performance and data and how the government's doing well in terms of the context of the culture, the sacred, the spiritual, and the family. Different performance measurements may be very different to what we're having to report up to Canada for versus what our elders may think is important to consider in terms of data. So keep this in mind. This is why this webinar was brought together. It's really to try to, again, build our understanding of the different dynamics and the play. We often live in hybrid worlds, or we take on different identities as we walk through modern and global world today. So we have to think of these aspects related to change management, collecting data, and the use of it for decisions. There's the private and public spheres that we work in. We're collecting data from citizens. We have to think about ownership and control, not just from the government level, but also, what does that have a bearing on the person who's giving that data? Can they get access to it? And I know that's a conversation within the Nisga'a Nation, particularly in collecting individual data, considering that. So there's later seminars, we'll talk maybe about privacy. And as we work with the assessment aspects of this work, we have a section in there which will look at these components. So why are we here today? We're going to look at assessments, taking stock. Assessments, as Harmony say, it's a part of the overall planning, taking stock of where you are, getting a good sense, finding that benchmark or that assessment of where things are to build forward a strategy or an idea of next steps. I've thrown in a bunch of literature from the public administrative side. So there's a body of work that's out there related to governance and governments, local governments, not often in the Indigenous context, of course. But there's some good insights built over the last 30 years around trying to build out better programming and making departments and governments more robust in how they strategize and think to informing key decisions. One thing coming out of that is human resources are critical. Obviously, we know that's very much grounded in culture too, and the Indigenous context. Families, people matter, right? And human resources matter. So that's a big part of assessing, do we have capacity in-house? Do we have the right human resources? And are the human resources working effectively together as teams? So we'll look at that. There's often many varied interpretations and debates about assessments too. My assessment might be different than Harmony's assessment, and that's okay. If you can use a tool sometimes to get a bunch of opinions, you do get some. If generally everyone agrees that this is the issue versus this, then you probably know that there's an issue on this level of assessment. But of course, debate and discussion is encouraged when we do assessments and analyze the results. So as we look at the assessment tool, I'd encourage you not just to think of one person in the government to take this, but multiple people. And there may also be some discussions about how you use this tool at the departmental level or at the senior government level. So you'll have to navigate through that. We probably won't have time to go into all the nuances of that tool, but I hope that you'll work with your support teams and networks, and you can always reach out to us as the Data Steering Committee and others, if the tool doesn't quite sit or you have some challenges with that. At the end of the day, we're really trying to set priorities, take action, and plan for future-oriented decisions. And I've just the last point, and then you'll have time to look at this slide and the detail in it at a later time. But really, the key is, again, I want to stress why we do some of these assessments is really to impart on the people who make key decisions some of the challenges and problems we may be facing, and then how do we think we can address that for the better? Okay, next slide, please. Overall benefits of planning and strategy. I'll sort of whip through this. Similar to Gwen's talk, again, it's it's working with teams, it's planning strategy in the context and culture that makes sense. And I'm also tired of output reporting. This idea of output measures, how many or how much is important. We need to know these kinds of things. But I think a lot of times in the overall planning and strategy and taking stock of where you're at, you're really trying to understand the outcomes. What's important? Is the program working? Did it have a longer term impact? There's outputs that can happen at the short term, the midterm, and the longer term impact. So there's this difference again between output measures, something we often do for governments when we have to report up to our funders, and it can be sort of a drag and we just want to get the funder off our backs. So we say so many people took the program and so many people did this and so many people did this, and then we leave it. And we probably want to move internally more to thinking about what are the outcomes, right? Did the program have an impact on the family, the individual? And that's some of this work we're trying to build, is some of the understanding of the terminology, but also like, what does it really mean to you in the work that you do at the departmental level for your government, and how does it have an impact for the citizens and people you work with? Often another point around assessments and evaluation of these things, you sometimes are looking at multiple variables, multiple things, and you may have multiple standards of evaluation. So I can think of an example. If I sit before the WSN or the elders or other elected leaders, senior people in the Nisga'a Nation, I'm probably going to think their judgment of what I'm doing and how it's having impact is more important than a funder, a young, recently hired funder from Canada who's telling me I should have followed the funding agreement like this to a T. Yes, I've reported on outputs, but I probably want to look at the outcomes of the program and listen to what elders are trying to say about it. Is it working? Is it not? So, but both evaluation standards are probably important. It's just using multiple standards at different times is the juggling act and sort of the skill set one can develop through getting a better understanding of this work. One thing I'll stress, we can move to the next slide. Yeah, we can. One thing I'll stress is that it takes work. All of this stuff takes work, right? Important part again is the assessments. Put a quote up there from Carol-Ann Tomlinson. Assessment is today's means of modifying tomorrow's instructions. Okay, and then I have a little cartoon there from which I picked up, which I found I thought was pretty funny. I'm going to need more specific feedback on my formative assessments, and it just says bad dog. So oftentimes, assessments are only as good as people dig into them and use them and start to work with them. It's not a shaming or name blaming, or this department wasn't working effectively, or the government's not working effectively, or that person. Really, it's like, let's assess where we're at so we can think about how to move forward, and what a person or department or government might need to actually improve upon that. What are the challenges, and how do we address that? And it's really taking a bit of that stance with it. So I do like that cartoon. I don't know. I've been called a bad dog sometimes too. But anyways, okay. So threw another example in there of assessments are throughout many organizations, right? It's not just in governments, organizations, not-for-profit, businesses take assessments, sports teams, educational schools do assessments. You can think back to the early assessments in report card, the first report card you took home. I'm being assessed. I didn't do so good. So you assess your home finances. You assess your health. Your doctor says you need to monitor and assess your blood pressure. So there's a lot of literature about how to do assessments and performance measurement that we can tie on. Again, take it in the context where we're at. I picked up this one from the Olympics, the professional Olympic sports, some key points from an author here. Continual assessments are important. So not just doing one assessment at one point in time, but doing an assessment, making remedial changes, trying to address it, and then doing a further assessment to see how improvement was made, to determine best practice. An athlete might find that they're not getting enough sleep, so they're pushing too hard. So in the assessment before, their performance dropped, and they made some changes. They got better sleep, they changed their diet, they assessed again, and their performance went up. Again, this is all about making informed decisions and driving decisions. Okay, next slide, please. Again, so what's some of the literature saying around planning and strategy related to assessments and such? Well, that it takes multiple actors to make really effective outcomes for government. It's not just about relying on technical people. It's not just about relying necessarily on politicians to lead things. It's a balance, right? And what seems to be coming out of some of the literature is the best and most effective change management that can occur is really when a team is functioning well, and there's a lot of relying on people's strengths and weaknesses. Like you build off someone's weakness, you learn from their strengths, but you let different people lead at different times. So it becomes part of a team. So the structures are important. So you might have a structure in government which follows protocols and practices around very strong cultural understandings. Maybe it's a hybrid between understanding hereditary relationships between the matriarch and chiefs. And there's channels for information, but it's flexible and it's innovative to also allow new information to come in and to sort of think through these things. So I wrote, teamwork is critical, structure, flexibility, and innovation seem to bring the magic. So think of the best sports team when the magic just happens and you don't know why. It could be the coach, it could be the players are all driving, but there's probably some very good synergy in there between the team, right? Some good communication, some important understanding of how to rely on each other in different times. Again, the process will be unique to each respective Indigenous government or nation. And in this case, we're really focused, again, on the Indigenous government structures here. Next slide, please. Assessments in public and private service. You can look at this. I'll go kind of somewhat quickly here. It's a similar modus operandi. I said similar themes come out of if you work in the public sector or the private sector. In governments, we're in public service. These are some of the key things in that literature I said was building on what public administrative data and understanding of how to make governments more effective. Again, assessments, more annual and regular assessments are kind of key in this. Assessments of an organization's capacities and managerial capabilities. Again, the power structures in play, the culture, the leadership, understanding that structure. So power doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing. Sometimes people really love clear channels of structure and authority that report up the chain. Some organizations might embrace a bit more of the flexible aspects in their government and seem to find that that works. Again, another thing, human resources matter. At the end of the day, people matter in these decisions, and it's really about strategizing on these kinds of effective aspects. And assessments are a critical part of this for performance measurement. So you can look at these. There's a breadth of literature out there. It's not just these few articles I pulled. That's really started, the public administration focus started in the 70s, and a lot of good stuff came out of the United States on that. And obviously Canada, it's morphing that kind of stuff into this, again, the culture and context of how you measure performance from the terms of the Indigenous context, which is a very unique and innovative space to be in right now. And I think for those young people moving up, coming up as young leaders or just needing a job in public service with Indigenous governments, this is a very opportune space and a creative space for young people. So it's exciting. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, focus on assessing your organization's data structures. Again, the self-assessment tool we're going to look at is just one example in many examples of different tools. I imagine we'll gain feedback from this tool. You'll work with your support networks and others to adapt the tool. So this is not by far, by no means is this a definitive or this is the only tool you should use. There's many tools to use. The key takeaway I want to stress just from this preamble here before we get into it is framing data governance and management does connect to overall strategic planning. And it's really, as Harmony sort of laid out at the start, how do you make data effective, right? It's not just about the data, it's how do you make it effective in your overall government structures. And obviously, many tools in the toolkit will lead to success. So we'll turn now to the self-assessment tool. And Allison is gonna, and Harmony may jump in here as this was very much a collaborative effort through the DSC. One thing before, I don't see it yet, but as we pull it up, one thing to note, I think important with this work is we are building our understanding from this body of work and these resources we have available that we've invested to pull in, different people who can support this, technical folks, and we can create some of these tools. There's other resources out there, and Gwen Phillips and others will have regional resources. The federal side, Statistics Canada will have resources. I can see this work evolving with the website and the toolkit is that we're just trying to make available some of these external resources and build a network across Canada that really tries to endear that community and family, I guess, of trying to encourage this work, again, for young people coming up who may want a career and a life in public service. So data governance and management self-assessment tool. I did see a chat here. I'm just going to see what that said. Please see here, self-assessment. Okay, this is it. Perfect. So just scroll, if you could scroll down a bit, Allison, just so I can try to read off the intro there. Perfect, thanks. Again, the tool is designed for self-governing Indigenous governments. SGIGs was a new term to me over the last few years, but the SGIG we'll use from now on. Explore the current, this is to really get a grasp of the current, your data governance and management structures, okay? Again, as it relates to sort of planning and decisions you'll make, and probably as you may want to morph this tool or adapt it or take it at different times as you attune to changes or interventions you may make going forward. We've structured this in a way to look at high priority needs that you may have, and I'll get into that, and just to really see if these are also important to you, these aspects. So let's just do an overview of the tool itself, Allison. We'll scroll through it and look at the sections we're going to look at. So I'll stop there, just at that, before we do that, just at the column rows. So the questions are obviously in column A, or the first column, and this will be helping you understand the components we're going to assess. That we put in a column B as a rationale. It gives you a little bit more descriptive understanding of what you're trying to assess. Then there's a rating scale in column C, the third column, which is, does your government address this fully, somewhat, or not address this, and you would score this by the number. And then there's a priority level to use. So you might say the government addresses this fully. We're taking care of this aspect. So let's just look at visioning as one example. Yes, we have clear visions in the government. It follows, again, maybe the heritage and cultural principles of a nation or area that you work. But it's a low priority. The vision, we don't need to rework our vision statement. The vision's pretty clear. So this to us is a low priority. So that's how it will work. And then the final column relates to where some information can be found on the toolkit. And I'm not sure if we'll have a chance to pull some of that, the website and up. So this will lead you to sections on the website as part of the overall toolkit where you could find out more information and direct your staff or yourselves, if you're interested, to follow up into delving into some of these aspects a little more detailed. And then once you go from there, you can broaden it out to other web resources and such. Okay, so let's go over the sections. So section 1 is visioning of a government. So we'll look at aspects, some components of what we'll assess based on visioning, section 1. Section 2, if we could just scroll down, this would be readiness to build out your data government and management systems, what we're calling, we put in brackets, buy-in. So buy-in is very critical, right? And it's something we often hear at the departmental level, or even as it goes up in senior management and government. We wanted the data, but we couldn't get it because people were busy, or there wasn't buy-in perhaps at that level. But perhaps there's not buy-in at the senior level too, or the elected level. Perhaps people think data shouldn't be prioritized for different reasons. Maybe they don't understand how it's used in the organization. Maybe it's a structural issue of effective strategy. So we've got some questions related there to assess. And you would do this, again, either yourselves with your departments, with your senior management, or with some support teams around you. Okay, next section. Section 3. Data governance. So there's some questions here around data governance. What success may look like. Okay, section 4. Information management, which is a critical component of this. How do you store and get access to information over time, historic data? There's lots of things in there. We've asked around that. Okay, section 5. So data policies, processes, and procedures. These are becoming a little more important these days, related to privacy issues, as we probably all heard things about Google taking our information and it gets sold off. And these are all issues that become important for Indigenous governments as data is collected from citizens over time. And also, again, how is this thought of? Do you have policies in place and structures, and even the infrastructure around your server and where you store these things? Do you have that infrastructure in place? Is it, again, do you rate that a low priority, a high priority? Is it fully addressed or not? Okay, section 6. Okay, human resources. Again, a critical aspect, a theme I've sort of drawn upon is that people are what drive the effectiveness of working towards key decisions. So we've got some questions around human resources. Okay, section 7. And existing data. So this might be how you use the existing data that's collected, either if it's part of your agreements with Canada and the province or territory. Do you leverage that data or not? Or what do you make of that data in relationship to your decisions? And how do you reflect on the outcomes of that data in relationship to what you want to do? Okay, section 8. Or we might be done there. No, section 8. Sorry, section 8 is the scoring. So then there's a kind of some math aspects that we'll have to think about when you score this up. But this again goes to my point about you want to make the assessment a bit more meaningful, and it will take a bit of work to do, right? And while it might be complicated, these are the things to really dig into, because without an effective assessment, you're just really having a superficial understanding of the issues. And you really want to dig into potentially like when I've worked and done some of these assessments, what I thought was the issue actually isn't the issue. After I do the assessments, do it with a few people, score it up, and I see it, I say, oh, actually the issue was here. I might have thought I needed a privacy policy aspect. Actually, my issue is that we've got high staff turnover right now, and data is not becoming reliable because there are too many people rolling in, and there's a capacity issue. So these assessments will really, I think, help in the scoring of some of that. And all it is you would add up the number of high priority needs out of 29 here, and then the subsequent piece below is of those high priority needs, how many have been fully addressed. So you identify, for example, I have 10 high priority needs we've identified. Great. You can have a look at that. Now, how many of those have been fully addressed? Well, if 5 of those 10 high priority needs have been addressed, you may want to target looking at the other 5 that haven't been addressed, bringing your teams together and sort of having a discussion of the real issues and digging into the context of that. Perhaps you make interventions, strategies around addressing those. You run this similar assessment a year later. You find out, we only now have 8 high priority needs and 6 or 7 of those have been addressed. So really, we're still struggling with two of these issues. Again, it's how you use the tool, and you can morph this, adapt this, or use other tools. I think I'm going to pause here and let Harmony or Allison jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to say, would you also say that it's you have an opportunity to just pick a single section that you know is the priority for your government and maybe kind of work through that?
Absolutely. It's really about, again, this is bringing us together as networks and support teams. And at the end of the day, it's how you use the tools here to make the successful interventions you see fit. So if you already say you have a really good understanding of what's happening at the certain sections there, and you want to focus on another section, for sure.
There's a note or a question in the chat around, is there guidance of what should be high, medium, low priority, or is that determined by the SGIG? I would say in my experience, I think it's a bit of both, in that the SGIG would have their view and their set of priorities and their plan to drive forward. At the same time, there are things like legal requirements and other things that people have to meet with respect to data that also maybe drive kind of the maturity level, so to speak, of where systems are where at and where there may be priority in investing in certain aspects of the assessment. Is that how you would respond, or do you have thoughts on that?
Well, the only thing I would say is the sections that we developed. So the overarching kind of themes related to data governance and management were drawn on a few of key books. I think we initially used a couple books that looked at data governance and had aspects of human resources, information management, using data. So we've tried to break out some key themes based on probably similarities we'd all work with if we had through that we all have to work with as part of data governance and management. But yeah, the priority setting it's sort of arbitrary that we picked a scale of 1 to 3. Some assessments could use a much more detailed assessment, a scale of 1 to 20. So you get a more granular understanding of these issues, but they are somewhat up to you, the Indigenous governments, to really work with. It's your interpretation of what is a high priority, low priority, medium priority. That's really for you. But if you think that the theme and the question isn't even the right question as it relates to these aspects of data governance, management, strategy, or planning, you can add a subsequent question. I mean, it was somewhat difficult to come up with a tool that we thought could be used effectively. The key point is you want to score something in an assessment. You want to have a good understanding of the kind of characteristics that you want to assess, and you want to really work it. So you think about what you're trying to assess. And I think if you start there, you're off to the races.
It would also be useful as folks are reviewing this assessment either today or in kind of the coming weeks, is like give us feedback on whether there's aspects of the assessment that you really want us to unpack in future webinars. So when I look through the assessment, I know, for example, section 2 is on buy-in. Well, today we're going to talk about change management, which should give you some key tools to start to think about, okay, if I don't have kind of buy-in from my colleagues, what are some strategies that I can employ? The sections on data governance, the next webinar we have, we're gonna really dig into practical processes around data governance. And there'll be a whole one on data management that will get into a lot of the information management, record keeping, security, all of that important stuff. So as you're going through, like, there are areas where we haven't spent much time. So maybe Allison, if you could actually go up to section 1, like as an example, because we're not really covering this topic at this point yet in the webinars, but if it's something that the group really wanted to do. So for example, if we take section 1, so I'm from Tla'amin. Before I came in today, I was trying to do this assessment from the perspective of Tla'amin, and I had to call my brother and say, does Tla'amin have a vision statement? Like, I don't know, and I'm a citizen, and I'm a member of the nation. What's up with this? And yeah, so he had to kind of educate me and say, like, oh, actually we did. It's from our CCP from 2007, which is well before the effective date of the treaty. Now they're in the middle of a planning process. So this is all stuff that I didn't know. And so it led me to think, well, has the government done visioning? Well, somewhat, right? So they'd probably rate that a 2. Is it a priority? Like, I would say yes, because they're in the middle of a planning process. So that would be like a high priority. And if I was involved, then I could kind of click on that tool and kind of work through. So maybe, I don't know if you can kind of click on that, Allison, and see kind of, does that take us to? So then that takes us to this part of the toolkit. And then, so if I was kind of starting a planning process, then I could pick up some of these practical aspects. We are going to have a webinar, I think it's webinar 5, on indicator development. So we'll be able to start to breathe some life into that toolkit section as well. And again, like in my own nation, I'm quite sure we don't have indicators related specifically to vision. I think they produce a lot of indicators related to their funding agreement. So, it's somewhat addressed, like I said, but it's really probably something that most citizens would say is important to them. And then there's certainly laws on information and privacy that my own government has, but they don't have a vision and principles for data governance specifically. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of give that example in my own experience of kind of where my government's at and how I might go about using the tool, but also invite everyone who's participating to give us feedback about, as you think about this assessment, like what would be most helpful for us to spend our time together on and bring experts in, because this webinar series belongs to all of us, so we can certainly evolve and pivot in the coming weeks.
That's great, Harmony. And so I'll just add to that. I think that's a key point. I saw some comments there about not keeping it too focused on the minutia of data management, the IT aspects. Really, this starts with some visioning principles and objectives, right? And that is critical piece. And I think that's why we did structure this as the number 1 section to look at. But if you don't have some of the guiding light, I mean, the Nisga'a Nation has a constitution, has a focus to improve citizens' overall quality of life. It may not be well defined, so that could be another aspect. You may have aspects of the vision there, but it's not necessarily clearly aligned to some of the strategy documents you have, well-being, focus, and such. So again, that's critical. This is a critical piece to think about how the organization is moving to what objectives, priorities, goals, where do you want to be? And if visioning isn't quite in place, and because as Harmony says, oftentimes there's a legacy of the old ways of reporting up. So doing this kind of work as it relates to accountability for government funding, right? The INAC days, we're self-government has blown that out of the water. So now we have to think about maybe morphing how we operate as public administrators and as government officials for public service in relationship to many moving parts. And it does start with a clear grounding of the vision, I think. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Harmony. Is there any direction now? We have a few minutes. Do people want to go into the tool, or is there more overarching considerations? I really appreciated, Harmony, that your suggestion that if folks mull on this and think about it, and they want to spend some and make the webinar a bit more, well, we should think of vision and priorities, similar to what Gwen spoke of probably on the first day about how this was so anchoring. Maybe we ask her back to think through some stuff on visioning, perhaps, but I'll stop.
Allison, any closing thoughts? I know you were very hands-on with the assessment tool.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that we're also inviting feedback on this tool and the rest of the toolkit. So if after you have a chance to go through this and try to use it, you have some thoughts on how we might improve it, we'd really invite you to send us that feedback.
We're going to move into the second module of our webinar today. Before that, I just wanted to kind of reinforce again that we're really inviting your feedback to that self-assessment tool and how to best tie that to the webinar content. So you'll see that we're connecting sections of that assessment to the topics of the webinars, but there's still room for improvement there. And we also have the advisors available to you to help you as you're trying to work through that assessment, and not only just work through the assessment, but actually respond to the assessment and advance the needs that your government has. So I'm going to circle back to this again at the end and talk again about the advisors, but just want to reinforce again that all of your feedback is very helpful. So now we're going to move into change management. So we talked a little bit about the people side of change and strategies to support not only buy-in, but actual implementation of the change that you're looking to make. So are we ready, willing, and able to do this work? So with that, I'm going to introduce Katie and Luke, who are going to lead us through this next module. I'm going to turn my video off, but I'll pop back in closer to the end. And if you need anything from me, I am on the other side of the screen, so just say my name. Over to you.
Thanks, Harmony. So my name is Luke DeCoste. I have a background in engineering and then started working in governments and was very curious about the question, where are the numbers? The numbers I was so used to in engineering weren't present in governments. And so I got very curious about that and spent a lot of time working in different Indigenous governments, largely in the Yukon, some in NWT and BC, and did a number of projects that helped me understand better what it is to make change inside these governments. That may have involved changing some of the processes around data collection, but it also involved a number of projects related to helping to roll out technology within governments. Some of those projects went well, and some of those I learned some lessons that hopefully I can share with you today. And I am joined today by Katie, and I'll let her share a bit of her experience with change.
For sure. So my name is Katie Newcomb. I'm an associate with Davis Beer. I am one of the change managers in our firm, and I became interested in change management actually deriving from project management. I was working on a lot of different projects, and we were coming across some issues with getting things moving forward, and we were realizing it's because people aren't buying into what we're doing. So I started researching more about why that is, and I became very interested in change management. So now it's something that I annoyingly push on all of the projects that we do. Sometimes clients are really interested, sometimes they're not, but eventually they always buy in because they understand change management is really just about supporting your people. And I'm not going to talk anymore about that because we're about to talk to you a lot about it.
Yeah, so some of you may have worked with me on a project I did with a previous organization, the socioeconomic scan, the environmental scan. And I now work with an organization named Davis Peer with Katie, and we're a team of about 45 people or so. And we have a really interesting mix of engineers, industrial engineers, and policy people, but also behavioral science people who help with this behavior change. And so we'll go in and we'll do an organizational, like a government department. We'll be looking to change the way it delivers programs or looking to deliver technology. And we have people who are very oriented around data or technology, but we'll bring someone in like Katie who will help create the conditions for the change to take place. So today's presentation, we're going to be talking about change management concepts and introducing some change management tools that will be part of the toolkit. And we're going to elaborate on those using the fictitious Sulingatuk government that you've probably seen in some of the other webinar presentations. And we hope that you'll ask questions both throughout and at the end. There'll also be some time as we go. So if you haven't learned about the Sulingatuk government, it was created to allow us to have different conversations as part of the data governance and management toolkit. It's intended to be sort of representative of the types of governments that are on this call. It has 700 members or 700 citizens. There are many competing priorities. I'm sure that's something you're all familiar with. It's headed by an elected governing body with an executive director, and there are 8 departments and 80 staff. Now, this isn't exactly the same, I'm sure, as your particular government, but hopefully it allows us to illustrate what's needed when doing change management.
So we're going to start off with what is change management. And I think in probably the simplest way, it's basically just all the processes and approaches that you can take to prepare and support people in making change. So it isn't something that should be one size fits all. I know a lot of people hear change management and it's such a buzzword. And people think, oh, it needs to be this big thing, but it can be very adaptive depending on the type of change that you're facing and how the people who are impacted feel about the change. For example, if most of the people are really bought in and they've been along the journey to where you got to decide to make the change, you might not need as many resources or tools to help support it as if you're trying to get people caught up on your journey, or if you have some people who are hesitant or feeling anxious about the change. So basically, change management is about supporting everyone who is impacted through all the stages of change. So thinking about preparing for the change, actually implementing what the change is going to be, and then supporting them ongoing as they adapt to life after whatever that change looks like. Also, feel free to jump in with questions at any time. I'm happy to answer. So continuing on that thought about change management is about supporting everyone who's impacted. I recognize as I was writing it, I was like, this feels like a very overwhelming statement. So throughout this presentation, we're going to try to break that down a little bit to show some really simple, tangible ways that you can support people through change. So we identified 4 questions that can help support leaders to successfully manage change. So the first one is about how can we make sure people understand the change? The second one is how are people feeling about the change? The third is how do we support people through the change? And the last one is what tools can be used to support the change? So we're going to walk through each of these questions and apply them. I'll note that all of these are kind of assuming that it's been decided the change needs to happen no matter what. So we're looking specifically at like a data management tool has been decided, they're going to implement it. And now what do we do to support people to bring them along on the journey?
So one of the 4 pillars that we'll be talking about throughout is how can we make sure that people understand the change? And this can be unpacked in many ways. So you may think, oh, well, John is just going to be the data entry clerk, and John doesn't need to understand that this is coming until it's on his computer and we want him to use it. But that may have John sitting in his office knowing there's something happening, not sure what's coming down the pipeline. And that can contribute to him not sharing information back that's needed, him not being willing to support what's happening because he's just unsure. And he like many people in your governments, has a lot on his plate. So you want to engage in a two-way communication. So you're keeping this individual up to date as you go along, and waiting to hear back from him as well. You know, asking questions, helping this individual understand the change that's coming, and it's important to use many tools and be pretty intentional about this communication. It's easy if you're in, you know, one director's office or a member of the elected official to think, oh, everybody knows about this new tool that's coming out. But having a system where you are planning to send out emails at a certain time and sharing PowerPoints and taking many different approaches will help ensure that the information gets out. And finally, it's important that the information is supported at the top. You wouldn't want to leave someone that's kind of lower in the organization trying to support this change. People need to know that this is a priority from people at the top, whether that's, for example, an executive director or even elected officials. Because if the people who are going to use the tool aren't interested in it, they can very easily just not enter the data and continue to use paper forms, for example, and that will limit your ability to get the benefits of implementing this tool. So it may be not intuitive to think about, oh, why are we talking about feelings here? We're talking about change, but this is so important to effective change. You know, if you're in a relationship, you know the difference between saying to someone, how is it going? And or can we do this? And they say, fine. Well, that's very different if they say like, fine, yeah, that'd be great. And I think it's important to really be present with people and understand how they may be feeling about it. It's quite reasonable for someone to think, I have a ton of responsibilities right now, and the idea of taking on another tool, that's overwhelming to me. Or I'm afraid that using this tool is going to result in our citizens' data being accessible on the internet. And it's important to really unpack these feelings, because sometimes they could be very legitimate. This person may know something about the vendor, for example, and really want you to hear that. So it's about really trying to understand their emotions and get them on side with what they may be resisting. And maybe sometimes you may have to change course. Yes, we've decided as a government that we're going to pursue this tool, but back to John is afraid that this is going to create a lot of work for his team. Well, let's listen to John, hear where he's coming from, and maybe we need to change our plan a little bit and provide John more resources. And it's, as part of this, it's also important just to share the grand vision. Why are we doing this? Why are we making John go through this work? And if John understands that this is to help us have better data, to better understand what's happening with our citizens and to improve the lives of our citizens, that staff member may be more willing to support this change, even though it's going to be extra work for them. So it can help, as we did here with the fictional government, the Selingatuq government, to kind of break down the different groups and to understand how they're feeling. And so you may break it down, for example, to community members, staff members, elected officials, and you may break it down further depending on different types. You can imagine if you're rolling something, a technology for data collection out, that community members may not be aware of the change. They're not really concerned about this. They're thinking about if the government's going to provide them with the services that they typically do, but they're expecting things to generally stay the same. As I was indicating with the example of John, staff may feel overwhelmed by the lack of resources to support their existing workloads. They think the data management system could be great, but it could be a lot of work and it may not work. And people may have been exposed to situations before with technology being proposed that was going to make everything better, and it didn't. And so they may be a little bit resistant to taking on that technology. And then finally, the elected officials, they're making many important decisions on everything from resource projects to housing decisions to thinking about elections. Someone has brought it to their attention that a new data system is needed, and they're willing to support it, but they may not have had the time to really unpack what that means, what the implications are. Go to the next slide, Katie.
It's frozen, sorry.
Oh,
there we go. So the next concept that we're looking at is how can we support people through the change? So I'm going to say this a bunch of times, like there's so many different ways you can support people through change, and there's so many tools that can help you. And again, like it can be overwhelming to think of all the different change management tools that are available. But I find it's best to keep it very simple and straightforward and concise and clear in your communication. So not overwhelming people with a lot of information. I'm just giving them what they need to know and giving them some time to digest and ask questions about it. So based on our understanding of the Slingertick government, we have identified 3 considerations when approaching the change. So one of the biggest ones is make sure you give attention to people who are most impacted by and concerned about the change. So we'll talk about doing a bit of an impact assessment, and you can identify those people who I think we mentioned the staff are probably going to be the most impacted by this change. So you want to really make sure that you're spending extra time with them and making sure that they're feeling very comfortable and their anxieties are addressed. It's also important to acknowledge that people experience change differently. And depending on how many other stressors they have going on in their lives or whatever else might be going on, past experiences with something similar, they might need extra hand-holding and they might need extra support to feel comfortable with the change. Another great tool to use are change champions. So they're individuals who are going to be key proponents of the change. I've worked with people who have sometimes chosen people who are the biggest opposers, and they take the time to really get them bought in and supportive of the change. And then they end up being their change champions, which can be really important in terms of getting people to buy in and see, well, if Johnny, who was very opposed to it, now is very interested, it speaks to the value of the change. And the last piece that we have is making sure that you have regular, clear communication that keeps people informed. A lot of anxiety about change comes from people feeling uncertain about what's happening or unsure about how they're going to be impacted or feeling like they're out of the loop. So making sure that they're kept informed of what's happening, what's coming next, what they can expect is really important in making sure people feel comfortable with upcoming changes. So our last question here is what tools should the change leader use to support the change? I'm not going to say it again because I've already said it. There's so many that you can choose from, but just looking at this specific scenario and just some pretty simple ones, I think that we use pretty consistently on projects that would be most helpful. We've identified 4. So the first one is a change impact assessment, a communication schedule, a question and answer document, and then a training plan. So we're going to walk through each of these in a little bit more detail and give some examples as well. So the first one is a change impact assessment. So the purpose of it is basically, it's an opportunity to look at everyone who could be impacted by the change, understand how they're impacted, and look at ways to meaningfully engage with them. So in terms of looking at the impact, it's going to involve some conversations, probably. You can make a bit of an assumption to start, but you're going to have to talk to them to see how is this really going to impact your day-to-day. And then it's kind of a values assessment to see how much they're impacted. So you can look at this person is very impacted, they have a medium level of impact and a low level of impact, and that might change how you engage with them and how much you have to communicate with them about the change. In terms of when it should be used, it should be brought in as early as possible. So as soon as the potential for change is identified, you should start thinking about, okay, who is this going to impact? How are they impacted? And what can we do to make sure that they're feeling supported? And then lastly, what does this tool look like? We provided a little bit of an example here. So you'll have the stakeholder group, you'll look at how they are impacted, you look at how much they're impacted, which is a bit of a values decision. And then you look at how you can meaningfully engage with this stakeholder group. So we did a little bit of a sample that is completely made up. So just keep that in mind. But in terms, like looking at community members, we mentioned earlier, there really is no direct impact. However, if the staff are feeling overwhelmed, community members might notice the impact to other services that government provides. Another one, if they're having to input information in a new way, you might have to do some engagement with them just to make sure that they're understanding how to do it properly if there's any changes there. So we assess this as a relatively low level of impact, and based on that, you can decide different ways to engage with them. So it might be a little bit lighter engagement that maybe is a little bit more one-way focused. So looking at like posts through social media or having posters or different things just to let them know about the upcoming changes. So staff, we mentioned, would have a high level of impact. They're going to have to learn a new data management system and adjust their practices for managing data. So they're going to have a lot of education, and that's on top of all the workload that they have already. So we want to make sure we spend extra time with them, given the fact that there's a high level of impact. So we want to have regular, consistent two-way communication, look at different mediums to make sure that they're getting information in different ways to make sure that they're really understanding it. And really just spending some extra time with them, given that they are going to be the most impacted. And then lastly, we have our elected officials. So our interpretation is that they might benefit from easier access to information, but they're still going to have a medium level of impact because they're going to be receiving questions from people about what does this change mean? They're going to have to be very well versed on what's happening. So we're going to have to keep them informed of the change through some quick, simple communications, some one-liners that they can share just to keep people informed. Another tool that we looked at is a communication schedule, which I love. It's a very easy way to keep things organized. It lets you think through how you're going to communicate with people, how you can make sure it's consistent, how you can make sure you're regularly checking in. It's another one that should be brought in as early as possible. So after you finish your impact assessment and you have an understanding of, okay, these are the people who need to be communicated with regularly. These are ones we should check in with like every couple of weeks or so. And you can kind of build a communications plan around that. So there's a few different ways to visualize it. I usually use two different options, which we're going to walk through here. So you notice the numbers are random because we just pulled a couple of samples in terms of different mechanisms and different ways that you can communicate with people. So usually with a communication schedule, we start with identifying who the recipient's going to be. And then we look at who's going to be responsible for sending this. Another one that we often will include is who's responsible for drafting. So if it's an email or a PowerPoint presentation or something like that, you want to make sure someone's on the hook for actually pulling that information together. Another important piece to capture is what is the purpose of this communication? So what are you trying to get across to this group of recipients, and what do they need to know? What's going to be valuable to them? Then you look at the mechanism. So how are you going to do this? It could be a mix of things. It could be a social media blast. It could be an in-person meeting. It could be an email. It could be a letter. Like there's so many different ways that you can communicate with people. You'll want to have a specific date for when it's happening. And then you kind of want to keep track of where is this. So maybe we still need to develop the materials. Maybe it's been sent. So it's basically just a tracking tool to keep track of all the communications that you have, that you've completed, and what's upcoming as well.
I'll just jump in for a sec, Katie. I mean, this may at first glance look like, oh, this seems like a lot of process to do, but it's something that may only take 20 minutes, and it can make such a world of difference. I've actually learned quite a bit going through this process with Katie. I would have done these things kind of informally, not really knowing the right way to do it. And when Katie was teaching me a bit about some of these best practices, I thought, wow, this would really have helped us. Nothing is worse than accidentally missing someone when you are going to communicate the change, and they start to think that they're being kept out of it for some reason, and they can start to make conclusions that aren't fair. Or another one is is just labeling who's going to actually be responsible for communicating that. That way someone doesn't say, oh, I thought Mary was doing it, or I thought John was doing it. This way it actually gets done.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I find a lot of times when you're in like this project implementation environment, you're so focused on getting the next thing done, and you maybe think that you're communicating more than you are. So having it actually written down and seen visually, okay, we haven't talked to them since 4 weeks ago. We really should do a check-in and just let them know how things are going. Even if there really isn't an update, that's still an update. You can let them know we're kind of status quo right now. A lot of people think they only need to reach out and do a communication when there's actually something to update on. But in the absence of communication, a lot of times a lot of assumptions are happening, and people are, I know some clients that I've worked with, they haven't communicated to their staff for a little bit, and then all of a sudden we're hearing all of these rumors because people haven't been hearing what's going on. So communication is very important. So another way to look at a schedule is actually putting it out on a calendar, which is something I like to do. It lets you see kind of at a higher level, okay, these are all the things that we have to do this month. So a lot of times at the beginning of the month, we'll take our this schedule and turn it into a bit of a calendar view so we can see, okay, these are all the things we have going on, and you can kind of identify, oh, this week we're not communicating with anyone. We should really probably pop something in there just to make sure people are aware of what's going on. And this is something that can actually be sent out to your high impacted stakeholder groups. So your staff could receive this calendar view and say, okay, we can expect to get an email update on Friday the 26th. It's also a way to hold you accountable, which can be a good and bad thing, I would say. So another valuable tool that I'm seeing used increasingly with clients is a question and answer document. So this is something that it's literally just a question written out and then an answer to that question, which sounds very simple, but it's really important because it's letting people get the same information. So everyone who's receiving it sees the same question, they see the same information, they can refer back to it, they can follow up and ask additional questions from the sender. It's just a really good way to make sure that things are being shared consistently. One note on this is that you'll have to have an understanding of what staff are wondering about in order to have a valuable question and answer document. You shouldn't just be assuming, okay, these are things they might have questions about. It's really good to actually engage with staff and see where their concerns are and what they'd like to learn more about. So it should be used once people have a bit of an initial understanding of the change and they've had a little bit of time to digest it. It should be updated regularly and shared with staff as new questions are identified. That being said, if there's something that's very concerning, it should be addressed right away. You should never wait because we said, oh, we're going to send out a change on Friday the 26th and it's the 12th. You should always just deal with things as they come up. So what this looks like, there's a sample question, and then this is a little bit long here, I guess, but there's a relatively concise answer written out that people can read and absorb and understand, and it just makes sure everyone's getting the same information. There should always be a contact person in case people have follow-up questions. It's usually sent out by email to everyone at the same time, so they're all getting the same information on the same day. And then our last tool, which I don't have an example here because it can be a pretty bulky document, but it's a training plan, which we thought was especially relevant here, where people are going to have to learn a new technology system. A lot of uncertainty and hesitation towards change can come from people not feeling confident in their ability to support that change. So if someone who has become very comfortable with printing out documents and putting them in a file is suddenly told, oh, you're going to have to use an online data management system, they may be very hesitant about the change, and they may push back quite a bit because they're not feeling comfortable. So having a training plan to address this concern that's clearly communicated is a great way to show that you hear staff's concerns and that you have a plan for how to support them through the change. So a training plan usually includes items like it has the purpose of training, what we're trying to get out of it, when it's going to happen, who's going to receive the training, the objectives and goals of it, some different training materials and development plans, and how the learners will be engaged. So it'll have, maybe there's different teaching methods, maybe you'll be using practical examples, making sure people have practice time to actually get into the system and try it out. So I've just talked through a lot of stuff. I can pause for questions if people would like. Oh, you're on mute, Luke.
Thanks. Yeah, we have a few questions coming in the chat, and we'll get to those. That was always helpful to see what you go through, Katie. One thing I'll just kind of, to try and wrap it up a bit, summarize. One of the most important takeaways for me is that change management is piece of the work. Often we think about, we need to procure the system, we need to design the system, we need to get budget approval, but we kind of forget that there's this body of work around change management, and just asking some of those early questions. How can we make sure people understand the change? How are people feeling about the change? How do we support people through the change? And then what tools can we use to support that change? Just taking, maybe setting up a meeting early on and thinking about that, and assigning someone to be a lead around change management. Just some of those early steps can really go a long way. We did cover a lot of content here, and this will be available through the toolkit, and we're also available later if there are questions, but happy to jump into questions that are coming up now. I see Harmony has her camera on. Harmony, would you like us to dive into the questions in the chat? Is that the...
Yeah, I think that would be good. Like there's one that, maybe I'll summarize them and then you guys can just kind of go for it. But there was one that I had asked, which was like, what happens if you're kind of in the middle of a project, you've done all of this planning work, and there's an election that happens in the middle and you have a significant turnover of elected leadership? Like what would be kind of the right strategy to manage that? I mean, that wouldn't be a surprise. That could be something you plan for, but what have you seen be effective in that context? And then Jen Jansen's asked a question about that. I think what she's getting at there is like the side of the desk thing, right? Like we ask people to do change off the side of their desk and sit in meetings and, you know, send emails and get trained, especially training, get trained in a whole new way of working without necessarily accounting for that in terms of their other responsibilities. So like, what does that impact look like? Obviously, it would depend on the project a bit, and just what should senior management be thinking in terms of how to provide for like the practical time allocation needed for staff to manage through the change?
Yeah, I'm happy to take the first one, and maybe Katie, if you can jump on the second one. So probably most of the people on this call have worked in governments and been through elections, and it's kind of similar to maybe a provincial government, where the staff, their job during that transition and during the election is to kind of sort of keep the lights on, not to make really significant decisions. You wouldn't want to make the decision to pursue this tool in the middle of an election, but you would want to make sure that pieces are moving along at a normal pace. And then when the new leadership gets in, taking the time to explain the project, where it's at, why it was pursued. And they, as elected officials, have the right to decide that they want to go a different direction. Now, hopefully they're able to understand the costs of changing direction in the middle of a project, and they want to continue forward. But I think it's about kind of just keeping the project going during the election, and as the government gets into power, and then they're going to be flooded with 1,000 different priorities on a big resource project and this housing issue and so many other things. And so the champion for the project may need to do some change management with them. What do you understand about the project? How are you feeling about the project? And thinking about how to support that leadership in understanding the value and why this was actually decided upon. And then, as public servants have to do, it's speak truth to power and implement loyally, and kind of follow the direction that they want to go.
Thanks, that was helpful. Katie, do you want to pick up on the side of the desk scenario?
Sure. I was hoping Luke would take this one because it's a challenging question that a lot of people really struggle with. We're actually working through something like that that's pretty similar right now. They're implementing a very large technology change at a department that I'm working with. And the staff are really struggling because they're having to do a lot of it off the side of their desk. And I think one of the best things that their manager said to them is that it's okay. Like, if you're not getting your day-to-day work done, we understand how much pressure we're putting on you right now. And just being very understanding of the situation that they've been put in. A lot of them didn't ask for this change. They're kind of just being told, okay, this needs to happen. You need to support it. I'm going to support you while you support it, but they're really being told what to do. So just being very accommodating and understanding and letting them know that the pressure that you're feeling is temporary. And it's okay if you're not getting everything done that you need to do, and adjusting things as needed. So everyone always has timelines and deadlines that things need to be done. And sometimes it's not realistic given resource capacity. And there needs to be some understanding of that and some flexibility to make sure that staff aren't feeling burnt out and that they aren't going to just hate the system forever because of this horrible experience that they had during implementation. So just, you really need to be accommodating to staff and make sure that they're feeling heard and that their experience isn't tainted by a really horrible implementation process.
Yeah, to not leave Katie out alone on that one. It's a hard question, and there's no easy answer. I would point back to these tools. If you're worried that staff are kind of getting overwhelmed or finding it hard, maybe gather your change management team together for a meeting. Go back to the tools. Look at do people understand the project? How are they feeling? And maybe you need, to Katie's point, maybe you need to say, you know what, let's slow the implementation of this project. Let's push a few of those milestones back and make accommodations to our plan so we don't burn people out or create resistance. It's okay if this gets implemented 6 months later or 10 months later than we had hoped.
So just inviting folks again, if you have questions, you can feel free to pop them in the chat or use your hand up function. Otherwise, I always have a million questions and can monopolize a lot of time. So while I'm waiting for anybody else's question, like, would you say that, like I've been participant in various, especially technology projects that are implemented and then nobody uses the system. And then later on, it's like, well, we invested all this money in the system and people are asking for a system when actually it's been implemented, but the change process really wasn't planned effectively and people just aren't using it, right? They still have their spreadsheets on their desktop or whatever. So would you say that like this type of process that you've described could also happen kind of after the fact?
Yeah, I think that's something that we notice gets missed a lot. I know for myself, a lot of times I'm brought in to support preparing for implementation and on the implementation day itself. And then we leave hoping that they'll continue all the change management processes that we've taught them. But change management doesn't end on the day of implementation. Like, all this communication, all the support should continue after implementation until you see a really good uptake and people are really comfortable with and just naturally using the system. I think that's the biggest thing. I would say, like, change management, I think we mentioned at the beginning, it's about preparing for, implementing, and then sustaining the change as well.
I think, Harmony, too, that there's and this is kind of outside of this particular session today, but some important questions around when you're deciding to purchase the system at the start. Like, were the right people involved, or was this just one department saying, I want this solution, it's going to help me? And then the structure of the arrangement with the vendor, is the vendor paid on the day that the system is turned on and then they go away? Or is there a holdback that makes it so that their compensation is tied to uptake of the system? And so that's going to incentivize them to sit with the people that are implementing it, make sure they really understand the tool, make sure the tool works for them. So there's some stuff that can be done up front, but I think, yeah, it's a kind of an ongoing process, and having people that are assigned to make sure that this is taken up throughout is helpful.
Yeah, Mark's made a comment in the chat that keeping the kind of why of the change front and center throughout seems to be kind of the common thread that gets pulled through all of the tools that you presented. Do you have any comment on that? Additional comment?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Katie.
Oh, we're too polite. and the why might actually look different for different stakeholders. So why you're implementing it and how it's going to benefit your staff will be different than how it benefits your citizens versus how it benefits the elected officials. So making sure you really tailor that communication for the audience to make sure that it really resonates with them is important as well.
Mm-hmm.
I was part of a technology product where I was the vendor, and we were rolling it out for a government, and the deputy minister wanted this tool because it was going to allow them to better understand what was happening in their department. And so they said, let's do a pilot. We'll test out and see if it works. But the staff didn't like using it. And so they just didn't enter any data in. And then after 3 months, there was no data for the deputy minister to benefit from. And they said, thanks for the pilot, but we're not going to proceed. And so we had to go back and change the product to make it easier to use for the staff and actually put some features in that benefited those staff so that, it helped them to track this data. And so a subsequent pilot was actually successful because the tool had been adjusted to accommodate both those kind of making a why both for the frontline staff as well as the senior officials.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That was very familiar to me, that example.
Yeah.
I've been in that situation. I see Jen Jensen has her hand up. If we can allow her to speak and put her video on.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Oh, perfect. Okay, hang on a sec. Okay. Yeah, so just to echo what Luke has said, having worked with TFN on trying to implement SharePoint as a document management system across the organization for the past few years, and it is a slow process, and it's really important at the beginning of the process to understand how people are currently doing their work and how they are currently sharing information and using information, so that you can make sure that you're implementing a system that fits with what they do, and rather than changing what they do to fit the system. Because if you force people to unnecessarily do things unnecessarily simply because that's how the system works, then that's going to cause a lot of resistance. You really want to make sure you understand what your current workflows are, and then evaluate the system against those, how things are being done now. Not to say you can't change how things are being done now, but it should be changed to make it more efficient and easier, not changed to add things because that's just how the system works, and staff just have to kind of live with it. So that's also really, really important. And to Harmony's question about, I have been doing this project through an election, and momentum is everything. Like, once you've actually started, it's much easier to keep going than to try and start at that moment of change. So if you've actually got started and got some momentum, then that can help carry you through if there's a change in leadership, to sort of justify keeping going. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah. There's two things I would say there to Jennifer's points. One, that SharePoint example reminds me that 15 years ago I was working with the federal department, and they were trying to do something similar, and it's never perfect, right? These applications are awfully designed for a smaller number of people. The vendor may be gone by the time you get there, and so, or even when it's like a big vendor like Microsoft who does SharePoint, they're designing for 1 billion people, and so it's hard to make a system that really fits perfectly. And so you may have to have this ongoing pruning of your garden where you're kind of, hey, people, are we doing our SharePoint thing? Do we need more training? Do we need to remind people of the why? And then to your point, Jennifer, about sitting with the people, we have a human-centered design practice at our firm, and what that is you sit with the people and you really understand what their day looks like. You're not in some back room designing some system away from what's important to them. You're really trying to understand, okay, what does Mary do when she gets to the office? Okay, where is her computer? How is she currently doing this? And by really understanding their day, you can really plan for success around it.
Yeah, that's so important. A lot of clinical and health kind of projects have totally gone off the rails because people don't actually know how the clinicians do their job, right? Mm-hmm. So we've been talking a lot about technology kind of projects, but like even just kind of simpler than that with any given kind of change project. Like I was trying to think through, well, what examples do I have from my past that worked well in terms of just bringing people along? So like at a local level, something that I had participated in, like it's many years ago now, was like we did family meetings. So like each family kind of gathered and we, you know, did a lot of really open discussion, kind of just in their homes or wherever they were comfortable, you know, related to kind of a fairly big initiative that the government was doing at the time. So that was useful in that context. And then in my work life, something we did at a certain point was we actually created a change group that was all of the admin assistants, because we found that actually they talk to everybody more often than even the leaders in the organization. So we made sure they had all the kind of basic staff communication, and they were kind of our boots on the ground change champions throughout the organization. So those were a couple things that came to mind to me where like those kind of processes were useful in advancing the change. Like, do you have a couple of examples that are just from your own experience that were successful?
Yeah, I've got two, and Katie probably has others as well. One is in startup technology, where I've spent some time. They talk about a hair on fire problem. When you're trying to find someone to procure your tool, you don't want somebody who's got like an inconvenience. They've got a hair on fire. They need a fire extinguisher, and so you're trying to find who has that hair on fire problem. And maybe it's the director of finance who just really needs this information every month. So they want to make sure that the education department has a good system for tracking education payments, for example, and those people can really support your change. And administrative assistants are often ones who you need to be champions. So you need to understand what's their hair on fire problem. The second one is a individual who was leading self-government negotiations, and they went through the first round to try and get citizen ratification, and they failed to get the appropriate amount of participants, and then got through successfully the second time. And he said, you know what works? And I said, what? He said, everything. And it's like, you have to have teas, you know, to your point of meeting with families, or you just kind of have to really make sure that you're doing the work to get the change to happen.
I think probably my best example, and I touched on it earlier, but it was just the coolest thing of seeing it actually happen. We were implementing, like, it was a pretty straightforward change. Like, we were just introducing a new form. It wasn't groundbreaking, but there was one guy who was very against it, and he would stand at the water cooler and talk about how he, like, this is such a waste of time. Why are we doing this? Blah, blah, blah. So we took like a day pretty much to sit down and talk to him, like, what's actually going on here? What's the issue? And actually took the time to listen to what his issues were. And he ended up at the end of it being like the biggest change champion for what we were trying to do for this whole larger project. That we ended up going to him for like everything, being like, do you mind like talking positively about this to your teammates? It made such a difference. And so just having like that one person who maybe is known as a negative Nancy a little bit, and getting them to buy into what you're doing can make such a difference in terms of getting everyone to see like, oh, maybe this isn't as bad. Like, if he's into it, like, it can't be that bad.
Yeah, if somebody's resisting, there's probably a reason why, and bulldozing over them is probably not going to contribute to success. But exactly like Katie just described, sitting, hearing, listening, unpacking can make the difference between success and failure.